Okay, here's a wild thought. What if a belief system, one that's designed to preserve faith, was actually a factory for producing atheists? We're about to dive into a really provocative essay that makes exactly that claim.
I mean, just think about that for a second. Can the very way you believe, the structure of your faith, inadvertently create the exact opposite of what you're hoping for? That's the huge puzzle we're going to try and unpack here. And there it is. That's the core thesis from the source material we're looking at. The argument is that a specific, very popular theological framework is, in effect, an atheism factory. Now that's a huge claim, so let's break down what the author actually means by that and see how they build their case.
All right, so to really get this whole atheism factory argument, we first have to understand two competing theological systems. First up is the one the author is critiquing, a framework known as dispensationalism.
So the way the essay presents this view, it's all about the future. The really big ideas here are a coming rapture, where believers are suddenly taken off the earth, and this core belief that God has two totally separate plans for two separate groups of people, Israel and the church.
Now, the alternative the author puts on the table is called covenantalism. And you can see the emphasis just completely shifts. The focus snaps from the future right back to the present. The key idea here is that Christ is ruling right now, and that God has one single unified plan for all his people, all throughout history.
And this chart just lays out the contrast perfectly, doesn't it? According to the essay, one view has you waiting around for a future escape, while the other calls you to occupy and engage with the world right now. One says the kingdom is basically a future thing, the other says it's a present reality. And for the author, that difference in posture, well, that's everything.
So the big question is, how does this future escape way of thinking supposedly lead to an atheism factory? Well, the author points to 5 specific errors that they argue push believers to pull back and retreat from cultural life. The author breaks it down into these 5 steps. First, if you're focused on an any-moment escape, it kind of devalues long-term work in the here and now. Second, this idea of 2 separate plans for 2 peoples can actually fragment a unified Christian witness. Third, a focus on rebuilding a future temple can totally overshadow our present duties. Fourth, chasing sensational prophecy headlines can distract from just practical, daily holiness. And finally, if you only see culture as enemy territory, then doing ordinary good work within it starts to look suspicious.
So what happens when a whole community starts to pull back? According to this essay, the consequences are massive, and not just for the believers themselves, but for the entire culture they leave behind.
To make this point, the author grounds it in this biblical quote. And the imagery here is so active and influential, right? Salt preserves and seasons, light exposes and guides. The author argues it's a command to be present and engaged in the world, not separate from it.
And I love this metaphor. I mean, think about it. If salt just stays in the shaker, it does nothing. It's useless. The author argues that's exactly what happens when faith becomes a purely private thing. When believers retreat into their own little spiritual bubble, it creates a vacuum out in the public square, in the very institutions that shape our culture. And according to the source material, this vacuum has some really clear results. Christ's rule gets shrunk down to just our private hearts, not public life. Key cultural areas, schools, courts, the arts, are basically handed over. Long-term, generational faithfulness gets weaker, and even something like the Sabbath loses its power as a public statement about who's really in charge of our time.
Okay, so after diagnosing the problem and spelling out the consequences, the essay moves on to the solution. And it's not just a little tweak, it's a fundamental shift in posture, away from private retreat and towards a robust public faith.
This quote really gets to the heart of the alternative. It totally reframes a believer's time on earth. Instead of just waiting for the evacuation helicopter, the command is to be an active steward, to occupy and manage the world on behalf of the king until he gets back. You see? It's a huge shift from a passive stance to an active stance.
And the author lays out the building blocks for this kind of public faith. It all starts with serious, ordered worship. It's built on clear theology that strengthens families. It reimagines your everyday job as a primary way you serve society. And the whole thing is held together by a serious commitment to public truth.
So the essay doesn't just stay in the clouds, it gets really practical. It wraps up with 12 specific commitments for how to re-engage with the world. Let's look at the big themes from that action plan.
We've distilled that list down into 3 main categories here. So under worship, the focus is all on order and reverence. For doctrine, it's about teaching a theology of engagement and, get this, renouncing speculative prophecy charts.
And then under work, it's about actually equipping people to serve God in their jobs and to pray for and participate in civic life.
As we get to the end, the author leaves us with a couple of really powerful, direct choices. This is the first one. It's a call to move away from what the author sees as noise and sensationalism and towards something more ordered, more substantial. Reverence over racket.
And here's the second choice. This one just brilliantly sums up the entire argument, doesn't it? Focus on the reality of Christ's present rule, not on getting lost in complicated, speculative charts about the future. It's a call to prioritize what you do today over trying to predict tomorrow.
So, the crucial point the author leaves us with is this challenge to re-engage. And that really brings us right back to where we started. No matter what your specific theological view is, the essay forces us to ask a pretty fascinating question. What does it really mean for any community of belief to be salt and light? What does it actually look like to actively engage with, rather than retreat from, the world around us?